One very effective way to understand the evolution of the civil rights movement is to examine the ideology of the early civil rights leaders and how that ideology began to change as the civil rights movement took shape. Booker T. Washington emerged as a leader in the 1890s, which is significant because he was the last generation of leaders who was born in slavery, as the Emancipation Proclamation of 1864 outlawed slavery. However, the Jim Crow laws emerged to ensure white supremacy and black inferiority and to limit the free African American population, often confining them to sharecropping, which was essentially a form of slavery. Booker T. Washington um, emerged as an accommodationalist, meaning that he acknowledged black inferiority and did not reject the Jim Crow laws, but fought for economic rights and spoke out to defend the African American right to vote. This this ideology is very significant because it's indicative of the fears of the white population that African Americans will get equality. And Booker T. Washington emerged with a more, okay, stop, Daisy, with a more tentative approach. And he was often criticized after 1909 for failing to demand full equality, which is indicative of the way that the tone of the civil rights movement had changed by that time. Marcus Garvey emerged after Booker T and was an advocate for black nationalism and believed in the separation of blacks and whites, but also in the need for equality. And he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African Communities League. W.E.B. Du Bois had a very different background than Booker T and Marcus Garvey, as he grew up in a tolerant community and did not encounter racism in his childhood. He also graduated from Harvard University, which was very significant and was an achievement for the first African American to graduate from an Ivy League. W.E. Du Bois had an ideology that insisted in full civil rights and increased political representation for the African American population. And he was a co-founder of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that began to use illegal tactics of resistance. And he was also an leader of the Niagara movement, which was a movement of activists who wanted equal rights. He believed in the talented 10th, an intellectual elite that would lead African Americans to complete civil rights. And he thus supported the education of African Americans. A. Philip Randolph used labor unions to organize the black community, and he founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the first all-black union. And as Mr. Neal always says, it's very important to organize a community before you ask that community to take risks in a form of protest. So the labor unions emerged as a new way to form that community, and a very effective way. As during A. Philip Randolph's career as an activist, he threatened to lead a march on Washington, which led to the issuing of Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in industries during World War II. And that's very important because it was a step in achieving the Double V movement, which was a movement that advocated for victory abroad and victory at home for civil rights, meaning that the African American population would attempt to take advantage of the world war that was going on in order to achieve greater equality at home. And his ideology is representative of the first shift towards a more direct protest. Paul Robeson, a singer and actor, emerged as another advocate for civil rights who attempted to use the organization through labor in order to protest. And that is, again, indicative of the new way that they were attempting to organize. During the early 1950s, there was a period of the silencing of dissent and the suppression of many groups, which included African Americans. However, the military and baseball were both desegregated during this time. And while there were not as many, while there were no physical protests, it still marked a time of the furthering of the civil rights movement, especially in the achievement of Brown versus Board of Education, which was a Supreme Court case during this time that issued for the desegregation of schools and repealed the precedent of separate but equal that had been established in the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case. During 1957, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott occurred, and Rosa Parks stood up as a leader and resisted a form of de jure segregation that required her to give up her seat on the bus for a white man, and she did not do so and was arrested, and that led to a massive boycott of the bus system. And this is the first time that physical resistance occurred. Martin Luther King emerged in the 60s as a strong leader and orator who was very significant in the evolution of the civil rights movement, and he attempted to organize through churches as an institution and created the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he advocated for peaceful protests. That means sit-ins, boycotts, marches, and that was very important because these non-violent forms of protest would prove to be very effective in the achievement of greater equality during the 60s. The SCLC, the NCC, and CORE are all examples of groups that emerged in the 60s as strong advocates for the civil rights movement, and they all engaged in peaceful protests. And examples of that are the Freedom Rides, Woolworth Lunch Counter protests, and the Birmingham Children's March. And what is so important about these nonviolent forms of resistance is that they were often met by extreme violence. And with the advent of social media and the proliferation of the television into American society, when violence occurred, it was produced in the mass media. This image shows a bus that was bombed, and that is in violent resistance to the Freedom Riders movement. Additionally, when the Brigham Children's March was met by massive violence, that violence was shown on national television and eventually led to Kennedy advocating for the Civil Rights Act. And after his assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson was able to get this measure passed. During this time, also, the Supreme Court upheld the concept of affirmative action, meaning that because desegregation would not happen on its own, as divisions in housing and funding for different housing districts was very split along the color line, the Supreme Court would enforce certain quotas in the workforce and in education for the inclusion of racially diverse people. The 60s also marked the rise of the Black Power movement. Malcolm X, who's shown on the right here, emerged as a leader who advocated for violent protest in order to end de jure segregation. And that led to the emergence of the Black Panthers on the left, who used guns as a means to achieve better equality.